Good afternoon, dear ladies and gentlemen. I'm glad to welcome you for our traditional press conference dedicated on the results of foreign policy of the past year. We would like that this meeting, just as previous ones, takes place in the format of a direct dialogue. So I'll try to be as brief as possible with my introductory remarks. Our approach to the modern issues have been repeatedly presented by President Putin, in particular during his recent press conference and obviously in his yesterday's interview with the Serbian media. There is no need to say that the situation in the world remained difficult. In the past year, conflict potential was growing, in particular due to the consistent unwillingness of Western states, led by the US, to adopt the objectively emerging multipolar world, and due to their attempts to impose their will by means of power and militarist and propagandist leverages. We saw attempts to influence intergovernmental institutions and erode their multilateral nature and substituted by a rule-based order, a new term that emerged quite recently, that hides a desire to invent rules based on political considerations in the interest of their use as an interest to exert pressure on unfavorable states, and very often even on one's allies. It's alarming that there is a desire to promote, beyond international institutions, various non-consensus initiatives elaborated in a non-transparent manner and present them as an opinion of the whole international community. It was not a matter of optimism that Washington sought to undermine the multilateral institutions needed to ensure the stability. It was demonstrated at yesterday's consultations between the US and Russian representatives held in Geneva on issues that emerged in the context of the INF Treaty. This is leading to a lack of trust and militarization of political considerations. In this context, we continued to promote our multi-vector course aimed at protection of Russia's interests, and we wanted to make more solid the approach of the Russian Federation in order to resolve the issues on the basis of international law, and ultimately we tried to make sure that a more stable and democratic and representative policy-centric model of world order is in place as required by objective realities of the modern world. In these efforts, we closely cooperated with our allies and partners in the SCTO, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization. We worked constructively within the Eurasian Economic Union as well as in the UN and G20. Under Russia's presidency in the Eurasian Economic Union, we contributed to strengthening of its global positions. We paid close attention to its harmonization with the One Belt, One Road initiative and development of strategic partnership and cooperation with ASEAN in the context of President Putin's initiative to form a Great Eurasian Partnership. As you know, this initiative is based on the logic of harmonizing the integration processes that will be open for all countries to join, both in Asia and in Europe. Global terrorism is suffering in Syria. It made it possible to preserve Syrian statehood and start transition to the peaceful economy and return of refugees. In this Sochi, Syrian National Dialogue Conference was held. The country's guarantors of the Astana process, Russia, Turkey and Iran, made great efforts to form the Constitutional Committee, and we achieved a consent of the opposition in the government. A list of potential members was established, thus a foundation was laid in accordance with the resolution of the UN Security Council 2254. in the interest of settling the Syrian crisis. We supported positive trends on the Korean Peninsula based on the logic of the Russian-Chinese roadmap. Undoubtedly, it implies the need for respective reciprocal measures by Pyongyang. We also signed a document on the legal status of Caspian Sea, so that the Caspian states have exclusive rights for its natural resources. We also tried to fight against cyber threats for cybersecurity. UN adopted 2 resolutions. We paid huge attention to preserving contacts and strengthening contacts with the million Russian world. The 6th International Congress of Compatriots Living Abroad was held last year, and of course, we enhanced our humanitarian and educational ties and humanitarian ties to share with the global community the best achievements of our culture. And we also provide training assistance. The FIFA World Cup was a triumph of world diplomacy. Millions of foreign guests visited our country. With their own eyes, they saw modern Russia and its citizens. In this year, we are going to enhance our efforts at all main tracks in order to promote the task of establishing a true universal anti-terrorist coalition under the UN aegis and mobilize international community to fight more efficiently against the drug trafficking and other kinds of organized crime. We'll promote positive trends and developments in Syria and other crises, in particular in the Middle East and Africa and in Ukraine, where there is still no alternative to a full and consistent implementation of the Minsk agreements. We are still interested in restoration of normal relations with the US and the EU on the principles of equality and mutual respect of interests. Undoubtedly, we will in the future duly react to increased military activities of NATO and the fact that its military infrastructure is getting increasingly close to our borders. Our main priority is the security of our country and other favorable conditions for dynamic development of Russia and enhancing the level of life for our citizens. We are open for cooperation with all those who don't make bilateral ties hostage to the changing international political considerations or use it to promote own interests, and those who are ready to look for compromises on the basis of mutual interests and benefit. And in conclusion, I would like to remind you, although you don't need this, a couple of days ago we celebrated the Day of the Press, and I would like to congratulate the representatives of, in particular, Russian media and the whole Russian media community on this professional day. We highly evaluate your work. We appreciate your desire to promote in the global information space the high professional standards, the values of open and unbiased journalism, and we stand ready to continue close and constructive cooperation in various formats. Undoubtedly, I would like to assure you that we will continue to pay close attention to ensuring free and unhindered activities of journalists and seek effective compliance of all states with the existing international guarantees of their security and their freedom. Thank you for your attention, and I stand ready to answer your questions. РИА Новости. Thank you. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov, Christina Rodriguez. I have a question regarding the situation around Kirill Vyshytsky. Bearing in mind that his arrest, the terms of his arrest is extended, what actions is Russia going to take, whether there is a possibility of exchanging him against someone else, maybe there are some measures of response to Ukrainian colleagues. And another question, if the US withdraws from the INF, will we consider prolonging the START treaty? Thank you. As for Kirill Vyshinsky, we repeatedly informed the media on the actions we are taking, both within international organizations and in the journalist union, and in our contacts with bilateral contacts with countries. We ask them to influence Kiev and to move Kiev to start persecuting this person for his journalistic activities, professional activities, under the guise of, under the pretext of state treason. I don't think that it will contribute to Ukrainian authorities getting back to strict compliance with the obligations to ensure the safe operation of journalists. It can only play into the hands of those who wish to use journalists as a political currency in their duty purposes. But let me assure you that we are going to do everything so that the the truth prevails and this journalist can get back to his professional duties. It's not the only problem with journalists in Ukraine. Almost all media, Russian media represented here, either have a complete ban for their work in Ukraine or are completely limited in their actions. As for the INF treaty, I have already mentioned that we are very disappointed that constructive proposals by the Russian Federation that made it possible, and I assure you that it was so, that the United States can see with their own eyes what the missile is like that they are suspect of violating the international treaty. However, the US came with a position that consisted in an ultimatum. Under the US supervision, we were supposed to destruct this missile and its launcher. We asked why the US didn't want to familiarize themselves with our proposals, with the specific parameters of this missile. They, however, ignored our questions and proposals, and they also ignored our proposal in response to our actions to dissuade the US concerns, to give us information regarding our concerns with the US compliance with this treaty. All this was ignored, and the US approach that was presented yesterday consisted in just one thing: Russia violates the treaty and the US doesn't, so Russia has to do what the US demands, and the US doesn't have to do anything in return. This is not far-going initiative. It undermines the strategic stability following the ABM treaty. The INF treaty is just another victim. And as for the START treaty, yes, many countries have concerns that withdrawal from this treaty too is a plan of the US administration. We hope it's not so, and we stand ready to defend the INF treaty, and we hope that European Western countries who are more than anyone else interested in this will also take effort not to follow the US position and not to adopt NATO statements putting the whole blame on Russia and ignore the Russia position, but we hope that they will try to influence Washington to take a more responsible position towards all members of the international community, and first first of all, towards Europeans. As for the START treaty, as you know, we are doing a lot in order to eliminate possible irritants regarding this treaty. We're interested in prolonging it. Those questions that we legitimately have regarding the actions of the United States on withdrawal of strategic arms and their presentation as non-nuclear arms, they are legitimate, and we presented them to the US diplomats and experts from other countries. We hope professionalism will prevail in US approach in the dialogue on strategic stability, professionalism and responsibility towards international community.
Please press the button.
Not the red one.
I beg your pardon. I'm Elizabeth Palmer from CBS. Good morning. There's been a lot of controversy in the United States because it's alleged President Trump hasn't shared the contents of his conversations with President Putin, including with some of his officials. We wonder, in the interest of transparency, whether the Kremlin, which has had interpreters present and has taken notes, might share the contents of those meetings.
Вы знаете, мне, честно говоря, просто уже трудно комментировать то, что происходит в Соединенных Штатах вокруг обвинений президента Трампа в том, что
the charges against Trump that he's a Russian agent. In fact, I think that for the American media, these standards being low, this is something that is not grateful, and I can't believe that journalists in the US can sincerely and professionally be in charge of these problems. There's such a concept as the culture of diplomacy, of talks, of interaction at the state level, and this implies that there are some rules of behavior and approaches that need to be preserved. They exist in each of the states interacting. As far as I know, the US Constitution mandates the US President to carry out and outline the foreign policy. The fact that this right is attacked by the Congress is well known. There's a lot of news written by your colleagues, but this doesn't make these attacks legitimate or constitutional. And I would not comment upon the actions taken by the administration in line with the mandate of the administration and the president. But as far as you touched upon this topic, I'd like to note that the accusations against Maria Butina that she pursued certain aims by interacting with the Americans. Almost any Russian citizen, be he an official person or, as Maria Butina, just a frontline person who wanted to receive education and interact with her international colleagues, she was accused of espionage and of pursuing aims that counteract the interest of the US and are considered illegitimate. But if you have a look at the interaction between American diplomats in Moscow with their Russian friends, you would probably be assured that even or primarily the Russians who are under the Russian sanctions are the focus of American diplomats. And nobody accuses American diplomats of the fact that they are interacting with people who it is prohibited for them to prohibit with. They are persona non grata in the US. They cannot enter this country. Another example of the absurdity of what's going on, the General Prosecutor Mueller has been working for 2 years on a case, and there were no leakages that would confirm that there was a conspiracy between Mr. Trump and the Russian Federation. There are no facts, no proofs. So and there are no leaks, and this is very strange for the American political system, perhaps because mostly they happen all the time. Besides the Ukrainian party, for example, they could find their participation there, but not the Russian Federation. Another example, Flynn, the former aide of President Trump on security issues. I was interested in the accusations against him. He's accused of the two things. First, that he had called before President Trump entered office. He called Sergey Lavrov, the Russian ambassador to the US, and he asked him not to be reciprocal about the sanctions that President Obama had imposed against Russia in the last days of his presidency. So he called on him not to escalate the confrontation. Was that bad? Was that counteracting the interest of the Russian parliament or people, that the future potential administration member asked us not to impact the Americans in a bad way? There was one of the accusations against him, and the second one, as I understand it, is that he asked Mr. Kislakov, the ambassador, to influence the stance of Moscow regarding the resolution that back at the time was discussed at the UN Security Council. It called on Israel to put an end to the settlement on the occupied territories. And as far as the Obama administration decided not to be against the adoption of this resolution, and unlikely in the past times, he decided not to vote, and Flynn called on the Russian party to veto this anti-Israeli resolution. Here, I'm not touching upon the subject matter of this issue, whether it was necessary to adopt this resolution or not, but he called on the Russian side to support the stance of the US that it's been promoting for decades at the UN. So these are two accusations against him. I don't know how many years he's going to be imprisoned for, but this is just one example of the chaos that is going on around this Russian history. Euronews, please. Euronews. Sergey Viktorovich, and my question is on the peace agreement. Recently, we've started a new round of talks on a new basis, and the agreement is supposed to be aimed at renewing our bilateral relations, and it is supposed to be supported by both people of our countries. But the one thing that Japan doesn't understand is that there were preliminary conditions that Japan is supposed to recognize all the results of the Second World War, including the sovereignty of the Russian Federation on the disputed islands. The question is it not the ultimatum that is criticized by the diplomacy? Because I have an impression that you are demanding from Japan that it capitulates once again. And I don't understand your rationale, because we are discussing whether the islands belong to these or that countries. But if we are to recognize the sovereignty of Russia over the islands, then what are we supposed to discuss then during the talks? Thank you. You know, I've expressed my position on this topic right after my negotiations with my colleague. colleagues, counterparts. But once again, the outcomes of the Second World War and their recognition is not the ultimatum or preliminary conditions. This is inevitable factor of the international contemporary relations, international relations. Japan, with the support of the USSR, became the UN member. It signed and ratified the UN Charter that has Article 107 that says that all the results of the Second World War are not to be disputed. So we are not demanding Japan do anything, we just call on you to bring in line your practical actions in accordance with the UN Charter, the San Francisco Declaration, and a number of other documents, including the one mentioned by you. What our stance means that Japan needs to bring in line its positions in accordance with the UN Charter. Well, the legislation of your country has a term, Northern Territories. This term is integrated in a number of laws, including the recently passed one in September last year that links the implementation of the joint initiative of President Putin and Prime Minister Abe on joint economic activities of our countries, and it links it with the necessity to return the Northern Territories. And this is not what we've agreed upon. It contradicts your obligations under the UN Charter. That is why this is not a preliminary condition. It is our aspiration to understand why Japan is the only country in the world that cannot say, I recognize the outcomes of the Second World War in a full-blooded manner. And then there's a number of other factors here involved. I don't want to repeat them. That is the military alliance with the US, the presence of military bases in territories. We've touched upon this in detail, but the President says that it is necessary to improve to a large extent our relations in economy, culture, in the humanitarian field, and in general. And besides, in the international relations field, no doubt for us to sort out difficult issues, and not only the ones regarding the peace agreement, but other issues that we need to solve. For this, we need to feel that we are partners at the international arena, and not countries that stand at the extremes. Japan, besides, joined to the sanctions against our countries, and this is not improving the relations. Japan joined the anti-Russian statements of G7 on all the resolutions that are voted upon and that Russia is interested in at the UN. Japan is not with us, it's normally against us. And right before the visit of Mr. Tarakan, he had been in Paris, where he had a meeting with Foreign Minister of France, and there was a meeting between foreign ministers, and they adopted a declaration. And if you read it, you'll understand that there's a great distance to not even partnership, but even the understanding that it is necessary to look for constructive approaches that would make our positions closer and wouldn't condemn one of the participants of our bilateral interaction. And here I would like to draw attention to this Japanese-French declaration of the 2+2 meeting. It has obligations for Japan and France to coordinate their actions within the presidency of Tokyo in the G20 and the presidency of France in G7. And this raises questions because G7 is part of G20, and the president of G20, that is Japan, is supposed to ensure such conditions that would contribute to the consensus between the 20 countries and would not work just for the interests of the group that is part of G20. I hope that it's not just the rephrasing of the declaration, and in our practical steps we proceed from the fact that our Japanese colleagues, with all the professionalism that they have, they would facilitate the consensus decisions and the elaboration that would unite our countries and countries that are part of G20, and they would consider interests of other states, because the decisions of G20 regard the issues that are of great importance for the whole international community. RD, please. Good morning. Russia Today in Spanish. Sorry, the question was for RD. The German TV channel. Sergey Viktorovich, what's your assessment of the further development of the countries of Belarus after the statements of President Lukashenko? What are the further steps if one of the countries is against this? And another question, our Foreign Minister, sorry, not Lavrov, well, I would be accused of the fact that we are going to take over Germany then. Well, he would be here soon. What are you going to discuss with the Foreign Minister of Germany?
Could you repeat once again about Heiko Maas? What are you going to discuss with him? Well, talking about Union State, you know that. Well, I'm rather surprised, I would say, with all this noise around it, including in the mass media. The treaty to create the Union State is an open document. You can read it easily. You could have read it when it has been signed, and now you can do it. And it contains a lot of things and a lot of elements which at that time moved us closer, and actually as a result we created the Union State. We created Union Parliament, the Court of the Union State. At that time it was a free choice of Minsk and Moscow. Well, time has passed, and we realized that neither common constitution or court or parliament is feasible as of now, but we are not insisting on that. We've discussed with our Belarusian colleagues during the 3 recent meetings between our presidents last December. We discussed elements of the Union Treaty, which, unlike common constitution or parliament or court, have to do with practical elements in economic and trade area. We talked about our actions aimed at common currency, common tax policy, common financial policy. These elements are linked to economic and financial and trade relations in the framework of Union State. And we shall see how we could implement these practical, specific elements. And we had a common position with our Belarusian colleagues. We've created joint working group that was the decision of our presidents. Our economic ministers are in charge of this group, and they will be discussing the agenda I mentioned just now. We've not invented anything. We just asked our Belarusian colleagues, taking into account their interest in certain specific areas of economic and financial sector. We asked them to see how we could move closer in relation to issues which we had to discuss, we had to solve 20 years ago, and they had to do with Belarusian interests as a result of this tax maneuver, as we call it. And I hope that pragmatism will prevail, and in this rather working situation, nobody shall look for geopolitical elements in the framework of the Union state. As to the High Commissioner's visit, as he stated himself, we are going to discuss first and foremost Ukrainian situation in Syria, and we have certain decisions which we have to implement. We are ready to this discussion. RT, please, you have the floor. Good morning, Maria. I'm Ilya Petrenko, and I'd like to touch upon three topics. First, answering the question about the Paul Whelan future, and he was accused officially of espionage. Your American vis-a-vis actually said that he is not going to discuss details of this case. Could you add something new about this case, about its development? Whether it's true that American diplomats are going to visit him soon? In this case, the possible exchange have been discussed or not? Probably it could be another reason for diplomatic pressure upon Russia. And talking about three other countries which declared that he is their citizens, Ireland, Great Britain, and Canada. Are they doing anything in order to influence the situation? And if it's possible, I'd like to give the floor to our Spanish RT. Well, rather short question about Brazil. In Brazil, we have a new president, and he is called Tropical Trump. Tragical? Tropical. No, Tropical Trump. Is it possible that he will be a Trojan horse for BRICS? And about Venezuela, there are certain countries which do not recognize Nicolas Maduro as president, including United States. What is the position of Russia in relation to Venezuela? Well, answering your last question, our position is the following. We shall not intervene into internal affairs of sovereign states, and during recent months or even years, probably during the couple of years of Venezuelan crisis, we keep supporting efforts of the region to develop dialogue between government and opposition. We know that such a dialogue, and a lot of Latin American countries counted upon it. Actually, it has been undermined, frustrated because of the position of the opposition under the influence of the United States, and this influence actually made this part of opposition which cannot, which do not want to develop dialogue with the government. We are against military intervention into the affairs of Venezuela, and the Nicolas Maduro as president, we recognize him well, and the situation is rather tough, and we see that the efforts to dismantle governments which are not following the interests of U.S. is still the priority of U.S. policy in Latin America and in other regions as well. We can discuss it further in greater details. As to the President Bolsonaro, he contacted our representatives, including our representative, which attended his inauguration, Mr. Volodin, who is the Speaker of our Duma, State Duma, and he actually repeated that he will continue the policy with the Russian Federation, and he would like to participate in the development of further development of BRICS. And Brazil is the is the chairman of BRICS for this year, and the Brazilian colleagues briefed us about their plans for BRICS, about their program for summit, and they briefed us about the program for other participants of this association. I see no reasons why Brazil will play a destructive role in BRICS. No, we have been assured that this association is one of the priority of the foreign policy of Brazil. Talking about villain, well, Mr. Hansman visited him, as far as I can see, as far as I know, and a diplomat from Ireland is going to visit him, probably even today, if I'm not mistaken. And we have received request from American embassy to visit him, and we, of course, will satisfy this request. British, they haven't asked us about it, and they are not talking about Consular Convention of 1965 between Russia and Great Britain, which actually makes it possible in such a situation to visit persons in this arrested persons. They are not mentioning this convention. We actually repeatedly asked them to allow us to visit Yulia and Sergei Skripal following this convention. They asked us, answered nothing, or they just refused formally to do this. Probably they now realize that this convention have been made null and void by them. But if they asked us, we will be more polite, I can assure you. As to this situation, well, our agencies, competitive agencies, actually briefed us about the situation in which this person has been arrested. His brother is here, and he knows about the conditions in the prison, and no criticism has been expressed, but countries which we have received, including Canada, they called upon us to free this person. Well, and they talk about sanctions. Well, I'm not talking about Russians imprisoned in the United States. Nobody has expressed any humanism in these relations, and their accusations have been invented. And in case of Paul Whelan has been arrested or detained at the moment of illegal action in a hotel. By the way, in Russian prisons, there are around 20 American citizens, and more than half of them, they don't have the second citizenship, and in a regular basis, American diplomats, following their requests, they visit them regularly, but no statements like we've heard about in relation to Mr. Whelan didn't have been made in their relations. No, the investigation is going on, and if you mean that his arrest could be linked to our idea to exchange Mr. Whelan with one of our citizens, no, it has nothing to do with the reality. We are not doing this. He was arrested in a specific situation. Syrian mass media, you have the floor. Thank you. Sergey Viktorovich, good morning. Russian diplomacy achieved great results last year in Syria. What are you going to do this year? In this situation, contradictory situation in the eastern part of Euphrates after the pullout of American troops. It's a very important question. In general, Syrian the improvement of Syrian situation is going on, is going forward, although not as quick as we expected. But we are sure that we have to finish our fight with terrorism, and Idlib area is the main hotspot of terrorism, and practically all fighters of Jabhat al-Nusra, which has been characterized as a terrorist organization by Security Council of UN, they are all there, and we're interested in implementing agreements which we've reached with Turkey in relation to Idlib area. But this agreement has nothing to do with the untying hands of terrorism. They keep using Idlib demilitarized zone, and they are firing at the Syrian troops and civilian infrastructure, as well as they are trying to attack our air base in Khamimi. This issue will be a central one during the negotiations between Mr. Putin and Mr. Erdogan. As to the eastern part or eastern bank of Euphrates, it's true, United States has declared about their pullout from this area. It's not a secret. They've established there, created there dozens of military installations, including large military bases. They've armed, and it's not a secret, they've armed Kurdish self-defense units which cooperated with them. And the question, our Turkish and our colleagues from Turkey question, what is the future? What will be the future of these military installations? And we are convinced that the only acceptable solution is to give this territory to the Syrian administrative structures and Syrian government, with the understanding that Kurdish people in their traditional areas, all the necessary conditions will be created there. We are welcoming contacts between Kurdish representatives and Syrian representatives. Their aim is to get an agreement in relation to about how to develop life there without external intervention. Of course, there are problems which have to do with American plans. They first stated that they will pull out their troops in 2 months, then in half a year, and then they said that probably even later. Well, you know, it's quite easy to quit smoking. I did it many times. This is kind of an American tradition. We shall not forget about yet another problem. I mean, At-Tanf area, which has been established illegally by Americans, and there are the refugee camp Ruba, and the access to this camp is closed because humanitarian convoy a couple of weeks ago, which actually we've organized with the support of Syrian government, and this convoy entered this zone, and in spite of American statements, this convoy was not, well, the Syrian representative of Red Crescent was not allowed to see the refugees, and this convoy was put under the control of fighters related with terrorists, which are trained there and which are supported there. Nobody knows what happened with this humanitarian convoy, whether it reached refugees or the fighters used this convoy for their purposes. Our UN colleagues are now starting to call upon us to send the second convoy there, because the situation there is very, very tough, because 30 or 50,000 refugees are living here without any international access to them. We support the Syrian position. This time, the complete security and safety and transparency should be guaranteed, and we should know that this convoy reached refugees and not representatives of illegal armed units. And as an occupying power, this country is responsible for their destiny. The American military people which are present there now, they are supported from Iraq territory.
They receive food and other necessary goods that are being supplied for the US military. So I think it's possible to use same routes to provide refugees.
Леван.
Kurdistan TV channel. As you know, the Kurdish people live in Central East countries. They complain that their political issues haven't been raised yet, and there have been no attempts to resolve their problems. What's your position regarding the future of Kurds in Syria and in Iraq? Thank you. Our position is quite simple. Issues raised with regard to the Kurdish population in Syria and Iraq and elsewhere. These are not the only two countries where Kurds live, should be resolved in accordance with national legislation of the respective countries. The rights of national minorities, whom Kurds are in Iraq and Syria, should be ensured by means of a dialogue between them, their representatives and central governments. We stand consistently for the respect of territorial integrity of all states in this region. Over the past years, these countries have been going through difficult times due to aggression against Iraq, Libya, and now against Syria. And it's important for us to prevent the closure of borders. I think that Kurds in Syria and in Iraq have understanding with regard to the need to find agreements with the central governments which would be acceptable for both parties, would take into consideration their interests and not undermine the territorial integrity of states. OBTV Greece, please. Open TV. Mr. Lavrov, your representatives, I mean the MFA representatives, in particular Mr. Grushko yesterday, expressed on repeated occasions criticism regarding the change of name of our neighboring state, the former Yugoslav Republic of Macedonia. On repeated occasions, you've mentioned the decision of the UN Security Council on this topic. I would like to clarify, what does the Russian diplomacy mean when you refer to this decision of the UN Security Council? Would you like to hinder this Tristan agreement from being implemented? Are you unhappy with it? I would like to hear your position. Do you have only two ways of answering this question? No. And in this regard, I would like to understand your stance on the situation in the Balkans. You criticize the US because it's expanding its position in the Balkans, and not only in the Balkans. The US and NATO respond that they are only trying to stop your aggressive actions in this region. What is really happening? It's a good question. You know, I've never heard anyone saying that implementation of a UN Security Council decision can be considered as an attempt to prevent, hinder resolution of an issue with which this resolution are dealing. I mean the resolution that launched the negotiations on the name of Macedonia between Athens and Skopje. We have always supported this dialogue, and we always advocated an approach according to which a solution is found that is acceptable to the public opinion, the peoples and the governments of Macedonia and Greece. We are not against the name that emerged as a result and was announced. We ask questions as to how legitimate this process is and whether it's really guided by a desire to find a consensus between Athens and Skopje, or whether it is guided by what you've mentioned, namely the desire to make all neighboring countries join the NATO and stop Russia's influence in the region. Of course, we cannot agree with those who say that Russia has no place in the Balkans. Federica Mogherini has mentioned just recently that the EU is already working in the Balkans. No one has to do anything there besides the EU. Once asked, she said she was misinterpreted. But not only the EU, the NATO is getting an upper hand. So there is a place not only for the EU, but also for the NATO. Maybe even the major role is accorded to the NATO. The position of the UN Security Council should be respected. The decision needs to be legitimate. When the name is adopted by a document signed not at the level required by the Macedonian constitution, for example, then it raises questions in our country as to whether this process is legitimate. When the Macedonian parliament adopts a law on constitutional amendments and the law on languages that President of Macedonia refuses to sign as required by the constitution, it also raises concerns. And when the whole blame is put on us for all evils that exist in the Balkans, then we ask, how do our Western colleagues consider the campaign that was pursued in Macedonia ahead of elections, when the heads of the EU, NATO Secretary General, leaders of the European Commission and the EU on the whole called in Skopje to give the votes for membership in the EU and NATO by means of changing the name of Macedonia. That was their agitation, argumentation. They should vote for membership in Euro-Atlantic structures by means of changing the name. I think it is a dirty approach. By the way, I mentioned in my introductory remarks the trends that we now see in the approach in the NATO and its close allies to substitute the international law with a certain concept of rule-based order. Look, regarding the Macedonian issue in the name of Macedonia, there is a UN Security Council resolution which is part of international law. It requires the respect for the constitutions of Macedonia and Serbia, and on the basis of these international law, solutions should be sought. But at the same time, not a legal approach is being applied, but a correct approach. So some rules have been invented in accordance to which a decision can be signed on the level of ministers and not on the presidential level, and so on and so forth. According to these rules, the outcomes of a referendum does not to be taken into consideration, and we see this happening not only in the Balkans. It's quite a dangerous trend, and it reflects a desire to make all Balkan states join NATO. Recently, I read that regarding Bosnia, in the US, there have been talks that Serbs are playing a destructive role in Bosnia. Some time ago, quite recently, a think tank in the US said that Dayton Agreement should be abandoned because Serbs would slow down Bosnia and Herzegovina's accession to NATO. Again, the goal is not a well-being of Bosnia and Herzegovina and its three entity-building peoples, but rather it's membership in the NATO. That's something we can't agree with. It's the mentality of the previous century. In a situation when we all declared our desire to build a common humanitarian space and ensure integral and territorial integrity in the Euro-Atlantic space. It's not something we should agree with. There are many examples of this. Sky News.
Diana Magnay from Sky News. The UK Foreign Office has confirmed to me that they have requested consular access to Paul Whelan. I just wanted to clarify, are you saying that they will only be allowed that if Russia is allowed consular access to Sergey and Yulia Skripal? And also, why is there so little information surrounding the actual charges laid against him?
Ну, во-первых, я сказал иначе. Я сказал, что
Well, I said something different. I said the UK refuses to follow up on its obligations under the 1965 Consular Convention, and I said that up until now, I haven't heard that the UK embassy addressed us with a request to give consular access to Paul Whelan, but I added immediately that once we receive such a request, we will not act as our British colleagues do. We will act in accordance with the diplomatic practices and our obligations. As for the information what accusations are put forward against Whelan, this information has been provided. He shared materials that he shouldn't have shared, or rather he got access to such materials. But let me assure you that information on what's happening with there is much more information on Paul Whelan than there is information on where Sergey and Yulia Skripal are. This situation is absolutely unacceptable. Soon there will be 1 year that we haven't been given consular access as that we should receive in accordance with the Consular Convention. We don't have any information as to their whereabouts. So there is plenty of ground to once again doubt the legitimacy of British justice, but we would like to resolve all these issues by means of dialogue and on the basis of respect of the interests of one another. The Russian Federation shouldn't be treated as a country that is obliged to everyone, as we see it in the conduct of Western states. It's unacceptable. Let's cooperate. Let's work on the basis of equality. International Radio, please. Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. A joint information service between Russia and China. My question is the following. As we know, the trade volumes between Russia and China hit records. It was more than $100 billion. China is the greatest trade partner of Russia. How do you see the prospects and development of trade and economic relations between China and Russia in future? The outcomes of the past year is already a first step. Thank you. Indeed, we saw a record level of trade volumes in the past year, and it's not the limit. We have quite ambitious plans with our Chinese friends. These plans have been discussed during the meetings between President of Russia and President of China, and during the visit by President Putin to China in summer this year, and during the visit by President Xi Jinping to the Russian Federation on the margins as part of the Eastern Economic Forum and on the margins of BRICS and G20 meetings. There are regular contacts between our economic representatives who prepare meetings on the top level. next such, the past most recent such meeting drew a conclusion of the work of nearly 60 bodies engaged in various spheres of our cooperation. There are some 70 projects that have received support worth more than $100 million, including nuclear energy, agriculture, transport, and cooperation in space. As you know, our space agencies coordinate their activities between GLONASS and Beldel navigation systems. So I think we have good prospects in trade and economic spheres and in the field of investment. And I'd like to mention our close cooperation and coordination of our approaches in global affairs, cooperation within BRICS, the SCO, and our cooperation in the context of the development of ties and harmonization of processes in the Eurasian economic, in the Eurasian space, and the Chinese One Belt, One Road initiative. In the US Security Council, we have common approach towards the settlement of international conflicts based on international law, be it Syria and other Middle East conflicts, be it problems on the Korean Peninsula. So as far as I see it, we have good, strong development of our ties in all areas. Polish agency, please. Good afternoon, Polish media company. Next month, the US will organize a Middle East summit in Poland, in particular on Iran. First question, are you going or any other representative of the Russian Federation is going to attend this summit in Poland, and how do you evaluate the idea of holding such a summit? The media already called it an anti-Iranian summit. And how do you see the fact that it's organized by the US and held in Poland? Well, I just wanted to ask you who actually organizes it, because the Polish MFA said it was a joint Polish-US initiative, while Pompeo, the US State Secretary, during his Tunis said the US holds in Poland, but it's up to you to decide. Indeed, we received an invitation. We received the draft agenda. It focuses on particular on the conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and problems with Iranian missile program, as well as actions by Iran in the region. The forum is entitled Problems in the Middle East region. However, it obviously lacks a mentioning of a key problem, namely the Palestine and Israeli settlement. And as you said, it looks like the whole agenda is composed to promote the US approach to contain Iran in the region. It's an official event, and it's held in Warsaw, but obviously it's aimed at achieving this goal. There are also concerns regarding the fact that the invitation says ministers, invited ministers, should not bother regarding the outcome document, because co-chairs from the US and Poland write to compose it on their own and present it as their own summary, without a possibility for other participants to participate in editing this document. Well, actually, it's not how things are done in the world. Some 55 ministers are invited to are invited to give more weight to a document that is composed by the US and Poland. We have doubts that it can contribute to constructive resolution of Middle East problems. As for Iran and probable influence on the relations with Poland, it's your bilateral affair.
Armenian media. Thank you. Mr. Lavrov, about the Russian-Armenian relations, a routine question. It seems to be developing the way it was before, but there are nuances, and we would be grateful if you cover them. I want to ask you about the future of a certain person. Today, you've mentioned a couple of times the Russian nationals whose interests Russia is consistently protecting, whose rights have been violated in various countries of the world. But there's a young man who's been imprisoned for more than 2 years in a neighboring Azerbaijan, Mr. Galusyan, Marat Galusyan, on a made-up charge, and the Azerbaijani side is cynically ignoring all of our requests and demands from Russia to extradite this person, for him to be responsible for the same made-up decision, but here in Russia. So what are you doing here to help Marat Galusyan? Questions about our nationals who wind up in difficult situations around the world, including in CIS countries. We've been touching upon this during our bilateral contacts, and this topic was mentioned during our talks with the colleagues from Azerbaijan, and I hope that through dialogue and with the help of the decisions based on legal norms, we would be able to reach an outcome that would be satisfying for everyone, would be able to return him to Russia. Ukraine media, please. Agency Runyan, thank you for the opportunity to ask this question. Mr. Lavrov, end of last year, in your interview to RIA Novosti, you said that you are expecting that in Ukraine there will be normal politicians entering into force that would be able to confirm the reality. Can you enumerate these qualities that they're supposed to have? And then why Russia doesn't want to exchange. We suggested exchange in Vyshinsky by a number of names. Ukraine suggested an exchange of journalists, and you wouldn't do that. As for the necessity to see normal politicians, I think that this is topical for any country. But as for what is going on in Ukraine, I'm not the only person who would want to see normal politicians there. It's enough to have a look at the Ukrainian media, to read some web pages. As for the criteria of being normal, that is respecting your own obligations, respecting your own constitution and your own legislation. Starting with the anti-constitutional coup d'etat, when the nationalists entered office, when they started overtly demanding, as Yarosh had done this, annihilating Russians in Crimea, or well, I think that this is not normal. And what is not normal is the position of President Poroshenko when he was running for president, when he said that he's going to be the president of the world. But when he entered into office in Ukraine, he abandoned these promises, and now he's been voicing more and more military and hostile statements, returning the so-called occupied territories, and he doesn't want to fulfill the obligations that he had signed himself, the Minsk agreements. And the following decisions of the Norman Court, he also discredits them by bringing forces to the contact line, and he is against the special status law of certain Donbas regions and the elections there. I can talk for hours about this topic. We have more than enough proofs. But if we're talking about being a normal politician and another criteria, then, well, fulfilling your own constitution and your own obligations that you signed upon when you accede to international conventions, the Ukrainian education law, the Ukrainian draft law on the status of the Ukrainian language as the state language violates directly the Ukrainian constitution, and you are aware of this. It violates international obligations of Ukraine. And in December, the Rada abandoned the Venetian Commission's recommendations of the Council of Europe that called on cancelling the Article 7 of law on education. So we can talk for hours about the obligations and things that would confirm the ability to have agreements. As for the exchange, a year ago, even more, in December 2017, we reached an agreement with the participation of Mr. Medvedchuk of the agreements. On the exchange, we agreed on the names in the list for exchanges. We've checked upon this list for many times. We've coordinated everything. But on the day of exchange, when people were brought to the place where they were supposed to change the vehicles and return, the Ukrainian side, right there, at this point, said that 23 people who had been coordinated by the Ukrainian party to be given to Russia would not be given back to Russia. Reasons, I don't even want to discuss them. They said that this had nothing to do with the events in Donbas, but all of these are talks that have nothing to do with the subject matter. But as for the subject matter, we had coordinated upon this list, the names had been coordinated, but Ukraine abandoned another of its promises. Now we still work on the process that is supposed to finalize or continue the exchange of prisoners in accordance with Minsk coordination, all for all. We've been discussing these questions, but there's no constructive approach on behalf of the Ukrainian government. As for the persons detained in the Russian Federation, and this has nothing to do with events in Donbas, we have a special representative for human rights, and in Ukraine there's also Ms. Denisova, who is in the Russian Federation. They've been having a dialogue on this topic, and I hope that this would yield results and they would reach agreements on fulfillment of these agreements. VGTRK, the Russian TV channel. Russia 24, Yelizaveta. The question on our close partners, Kazakhstan, they are switching to Latin alphabet. What do you think that Moscow is still a key partner for them given this? And as for our partners from Eastern Europe, there are still hostile steps taken. The Russian language is impossible as the education language. The monuments are still dismantled, and the nationalists are declared heroes. What are you doing on this track, and can you raise awareness about this to stop it? As for our partners and allies from the CSTO and CIS in Eurasian Economic Union, we have good relations with them, including with Kazakhstan. As you know, this is one of our most frequently visited platforms. Presidents visit each other several times a year. They always have telephone conversations, and we want to further develop our cooperation within the Eurasian Economic Union as members of this union. In Kazakhstan, there are indeed decisions taken that they want to switch to Latin alphabet. This is the decision of our partners from Kazakhstan. At the same time, these decisions are not going to violate or undermine the rights of Russian-speaking and writing people. This has nothing to do with it. And wherever our compatriots live, we pay a lot of attention to their rights and interests, and we ensure their rights and interests in the places of living. For us, this is priority, and we have these issues on the agenda with Kazakhstan, other CIS countries, and in countries of Europe, America, and other regions where our compatriots live. So for us, this is a #1 priority. Regarding the restoration of neo-Nazi and national trends in Eastern Europe, these are Baltic countries, Poland, unfortunately. We strongly condemn attempts to rewrite history, the outcomes of the Second World War, of the Great Patriotic War, or of the revision of history in general. This is not something that the politicians are in charge of. This is the thing that the historians are supposed to do. There's a commission of historians who meet even in these difficult times. They meet, they coordinate on joint approaches, and this is a very useful form of work. By the way, you mentioned Kazakhstan and other CIS countries. I supported this, and we touched upon this with our colleagues from the Institute of Russian and General History that are in charge of this joint group of historians. I would support the same work within the Commonwealth of Independent States, because our countries had a common past. We had one country, so we know the principles, the basis of our country, what was before we had become a single country, what happened after 1991. We've repeatedly adopted resolution at the UN about the intolerance of glorification of Nazism. The last such resolution was adopted in December by a majority of votes. Only Ukraine and the US were against this resolution, which is exemplary, by the way. And as for the CES-TEO, we adopted a number of documents that were later disseminated in the OSCE and at the UN that condemned the dismantling of monuments. As for the repetitions of this war against monuments, we see these happening in Hungary, in Bulgaria, in Germany. And here we note that the authorities in the majority of cases respond promptly and clearly in accordance with their obligations. As for our Polish counterparts, we have reached understanding on this. The statement that the monuments that are not close to the burial places, they are not protected by bilateral agreements. And this is a wrong interpretation of this agreement, and the lawyers who would read this text would confirm this. Here we want to reach understanding, mutual understanding, especially given that Russia protects the monuments for the international war heroes, including from Eastern Europe, who died in Russia, and we cooperate on specific terms. And here is an example of what we do with Slovenia. It takes thoroughly care of the old monuments and even erects new monuments in memory of our military brotherhood. And today nowadays we are going to put new monuments for the heroes here in Russia. And as for raising awareness, no doubt this is very important. It is also very important for the youth in Europe, in CIS, in Russia, for it to know history, for the youth not to become simpletons who know anything, who know nothing about their past and about their relatives. That would be destructive for the culture and European civilization. As for raising awareness for this propaganda work, it is very important to ensure that the legal obligations are fulfilled regarding the monuments of the Second World War for the states in Europe to take care of them. Estonian TV channel, please. Thank you, Mr. Lavrov. Anton Alexeyev. I want to join my colleague from Russia 24. The 3rd of March in Estonia, there will be parliamentary elections. The new party of Estonia suggests that there be united schools where Estonian and Russian children would study together in Estonian language. And according to this party, it would allow to overcome the split and segregation in the society, because Russians are kind of like in ghetto, but this way they would be united. What's your opinion of this? And the second question, our Interior Ministry also expressed her opinion on this. She said that there are people without citizenship, about 70,000-80,000 people, and within a limited amount of time, these people could have asked for citizenship and receive it. As the criticism, the response to what she said was, maybe some people don't want to have any citizenship because in Estonia they have a right to enter Russia without visa, but having Estonian citizenship, they wouldn't be able to enter Russia without visa. What's your opinion? Thank you. Regarding the United Schools idea, I never heard about it, but the way you've described it, it's simply unacceptable because it undermines the interests of the Russian-speaking minority, and it's aimed at incorporating this minority, enforcing it, violently incorporating it into the Estonian language space, this at the cost of receiving education in their mother tongue. And this contradicts the conventions of the Council of Europe and other human rights on minorities' languages. As for the events regarding the Russian language in Estonia and other Baltic countries, this is something serious that, well, is something bad for these countries and for the European Union and NATO, because this is not only an alliance, this is also an alliance of democracy when we speak about NATO. And I asked the Secretary General of NATO, and I asked the heads of OSCE, the Council of Europe and the UN, I wanted them to pay attention to this discrimination of Russian-speaking people and the shameful phenomena of having no citizenship. As for what the Interior Ministry of Estonia said, that everyone is supposed to receive citizenship who live in Estonia starting with 1981. Well, let's put aside the decisions of each person. If a person believes that the passport of a citizen allows to receive some benefits, then, well, this is everybody's own choice. But I heard that once this initiative was expressed, the foreign minister of Estonia said that this is a personal opinion of Interior Ministry to grant citizenship to everyone who started living in Estonia starting with 1991. Well, that's not the case. This is not her personal opinion. This is one of the recommendations of the Council of Europe, OSCE, and it's been voiced long ago for the Estonian authorities. I hope that this or that form, the solution of this non-citizenship would be found, and the European Union and the NATO, the OSCE and the Council of Europe are supposed to play a more proactive role in here. Financial Times.
Minister Lavrov, I'd like to ask you about the Democratic Republic of Congo. Yesterday, the Financial Times published 2 sets of official data that proved the results of the recent presidential election in that country was fraudulent. Does Russia believe the election was fair and the result was genuine? And secondly, given the widespread concern of vote rigging and Russia's commitment to democracy in Africa, does Moscow support a full investigation into the vote? Thank you.
Investigation where?
In the Democratic Republic of Congo. So
Investigation of what?
the election, the presidential election.
Ну, знаете, если Financial Times опубликовал официальный результат, мне что-то добавить.
So the Financial Times published investigations. I have nothing to add here. How can I comment what the Financial Times have published? I heard that the results of elections in Congo, once they were announced, were doubted upon. They cast doubt. The French foreign minister expressed his opinion. Other ministers did this as well. They called in Congo to hold another elections or to count once again the votes, but we do not interfere with the elections, the results of elections, and the Congolese people can handle this on their own. Here it's important to respect their right to do so and not to impose these or that agreements, as it often happens in the actions of the US, France, in Africa, in your former colonies. Well, you need to continue developing relations with them. We, of course, would welcome this, but these old ties, quite often this interaction is implemented in a way of imposed recommendations from the outside. But what we suggest and what we try to do in our interaction is to be more respectful in relations with Africa. President Trump said that it is important to create no-fly zones in the north of Syria, and President Erdogan confirmed that it is important to have these zones. What do you think about this plan?
We will evaluate it in the context of the general development of the situation in Syria, and Mr. Trump declared that American troops will be pulled out from Syria, and the 20 miles buffer zone has been mentioned in this context. It has been related to the future activities, among others, the control from the central government should control its territory, and we will discuss it when Mr. Erdogan will come here to continue negotiating with President Putin. But the main idea is to restore the sovereignty and territorial integrity of Syrian Republic. Turkey, Russia, and other UN member states supported it. Yes, we did our best to take into account interests of all parties involved, all the neighbors of Syria, and as well as security interests of all countries of the region, including Turkey. It will be a part of the agreements which we will try to achieve. Thank you. Radio of Islandia. Islandia lost its market because of the sanctions and response of Russia to the sanctions. I'm talking about seafood market in Russia. This used to be one of the main markets for our seafood, and in order to restore the situation, a lot of our seafood companies actually were bankrupt, declared their bankruptcy. In order to restore market in Russia, what Iceland should do. And now talking about monuments. In Iceland we have great monument to Russian soldiers killed there. We are not part of the policy which we can see in certain countries in relation to those who died during the war. So, question about sanctions. Well, everybody should, well, it should be clear to everybody. When sanctions have been imposed against Russia, we were forced to answer in relation to the products which is agricultural products or foodstuffs. Why? Because EU sanctions which have been imposed against Russia several years ago, and Icelandia is part of the sanctions. So their aim used to be to impose restrictions and restrictive measures, actually, in relation to Russian banks, including those banks which offer credits to agricultural sector. And our agricultural producers actually, as a result, faced discriminatory conditions, when it comes to getting credits from those banks. That's why we responded in relation to food and products and other agricultural products which Russia used to import. How to improve the situation? Well, we should get rid of sanctions in our international affairs, although they gain popularity, more and more popularity in the West and first and foremost in the United States. There is only one way out. Competition, indecent competition like that we should get rid of it, and we shall not continue taking these measures. Those who actually impose sanctions first should make the first step. They keep telling us, well, we are ready to get rid of the sanctions, but Russia should do something about that first. Well, it were not us who created this problem. Well, sanctions or crisis in the Council of Europe or Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. Yeah, we do understand that we should depart from this policy, but give us the reason, show us that they're saying us that they're telling us that, well, we are ready to do this, but you first should to give us reason to get rid of the sanctions. Well, we should be honest. Well, many now recognize that sanctions were a mistake. Measures should be taken, and we are ready to respond to this positively and quickly. Stanislav Tropila, First Arctic TV channel, Yamal region. I have another question. Last year, Foreign Ministry or around 20 Russian ambassadors actually visited Yamal in order to get familiar with its potential. How could you evaluate the interaction with Russian regions, whether it's productive or not? And are you going to continue this policy? And are we satisfied with the cooperation which exists in Arctica? Well, through you, I'd like to thank the leadership of your region for inviting our ambassadors. It's a long-standing practice. Every 2 years, we have a meeting of Russian ambassadors in Moscow, and our president attends it regularly. We create working groups which analyze different aspects of our foreign policy and foreign activities, and for us it's very important. Well, for our ambassadors it's very important. Today, when diplomacy is of a global nature, not limited by political aspects, but they are also take into account economic interests and interests of our economic companies. So for ambassadors in this situation, it's very important to know what is going on in our regions. That's why every 2 years, when ambassadors come to Moscow to attend this meeting, we ask our regions to organize such visits. Last year, there have been 3 regions attended by our ambassadors, including Yamal was among them. For them, it was very important. I talked with some of them, and for them, it was very important to see how regions are living, especially regions which are driving force of Russian development, and projects of a high level, international level, are implemented there. Well, the role of regions in our foreign policy is outstanding. There are regions in Russia, together with the federal center, and these regions, they are promoting their external links. We have a presidential decree which regulate our regions' external relations, and MFA is the coordinator of this process. We have to follow a common foreign policy. We are not partisan of micromanagement. Though regions are free to conclude agreements, to sign agreements with their neighbors, and not only with neighbors. They are doing this with the support of economic bloc of our government. But our role is to see that it should be that it is part of our common foreign policy. We have a council of regions, and 7 regions every year are represented there. They are rotating, plus Ministry of Economic Development, Ministry of Industry and Trade, our customs and other agencies which are linked with these interests, external economic interests of our region. Arctic Council is a very useful organization, it's a very useful forum, and we support its activities. This is a structure which is not involved in geopolitical controversies. It's it's a non-political organization. Finland is now chairing the Arctic Council. They are planning to organize projects which will be announced soon. But as to the development of resources of the northern part of our country and other countries, as to the interests of the people living there, it's very important. Together with the development of our transport infrastructure, we are contributing to that, and as to the safe and secure use of northern maritime route. Rajab Safarov, Iran rule. Sergey Viktorovich, it's quite evident that foreign policy of Russia has become a factor of international security. It has become constructive, rather tough, serious, as its leader, Mr. Lavrov, and now Russia is respected worldwide. Russia has come back to Middle East as a very serious player. Its Russian position is taken into account, and thanks to a Russian policy, a lot of challenges in the world and in the region have become, well, we are starting to solve these problems, and this is most in great measure thanks to Russian policy. European Union does not have a potential, and it's evident, a potential which was announced because of Mr. Trump's decision to pull out from the nuclear agreement with Iran. The European Union promised that they would develop financial mechanism in order to continue dialogue with Iran. The obligation which the international community assumed on the basis of these agreements, and then the EU promised to compensate to European companies which will fall under the sanctions regime. This potential does not exist, and the sovereignty to protect interests of European companies and to actually implement the security interests of Europe, it's rather questionable. The question is the following. Back in the Soviet Union, the bank with a capitalization of $5 million has been established, and the central bank of Iran at that time, the capitalization was $500,000. So this bank, created back in the Soviet Union, has become a very important driving force for trade, development, agriculture, and economy. And it actually consolidated the position of Soviet Union in Iran. And later, the Soviet Union bought out the share of Iran in this bank. We don't have a single bank working in Iran, foreign bank. We are expecting the position of the European Union, but they are not capable of supporting such a decision financially. You are the leader of Russian foreign policy. So, for, say, Ministry of Economic Development and Ministry of Trade and Industry, whether it's worthwhile to create a special Russian-Iran bank which could use Iranian rial and Russian ruble, and it will not be. In this situation, it will not suffer from U.S. and other European sanctions, and it will help us to boost the relations with Iran. Well, our foreign policy is determined by the Russian president in accordance with our constitution. We are trying to implement such policy. Thank you for your positive words. As to the joint comprehensive plan of action in relation to Iran, the participants of GCPOA met in Vienna last autumn, then in New York at the level of foreign ministers. Well, we talked about this with the European Union, and they promised to create a special purpose vehicle, financial mechanism which will be independent from SWIFT or United States, and U.S. is controlling via dollar the SWIFT and the exchange. The dollar is over-evaluated now, so EU promised us to finish this job. For my deputy minister contacted recently European Union colleagues, but as we can see, time is moving fast and their actions are quite slow. In Iran, this problem is discussed also, and it's a rather controversial issue. Political circles make controversial statements, but with no results. EU cannot achieve positive result. I don't know why. You mentioned Balkans, Kosovo, where EU played a rather positive role, and Belgrade and Pristina, thanks to them, reached many important agreements. A couple of years ago, they stated that they will create the community of Serbs communities in Kosovo. It has not been created. Pristina is refusing to do anything. EU can do anything about this approach of Pristina. Now coming back to Iran, I can tell you the following. I heard about Russian-Persian bank. Well, it's not that important whether we will have a bank or other mechanism. The aim is quite clear. The trade between Iran and other countries, including Russian Federation, shall not depend on unilateral actions of the United States. And I can assure you that our Ministry of Trade and our agencies, they are making steps. Our Iranian partners are familiar with that, and other trade partners are doing the same. We should move faster than we planned before to the situation when we use national currencies in our relations, and other issues are also under discussions. Austrian press agency. Euronews. Thank you. Galina Polonskaya, Euronews. The first question has to do with BRICS. We see the new turn here, and everybody is now watching closely the Brexit process. Great Britain, after the Skripal's cases, well, our relations with Britain are rather tense. What is the best? Is the best result of this for Russia, taking into account the situation in Europe? And second question has to do with Serbia. Serbia is trying to move from the situation when it has to choose between Russia and EU, but you've worked in Serbia last year rather fruitfully. Mr. Putin is now going to visit it. What is the main interest of the foreign policy of Russia in Syria? Well, as to the Brexit, it's up to the Great Britain. It's internal problem of Great Britain, and we are indifferent. It doesn't matter for us how it will affect European Union. The European Union as an organization, well, at the national level, our main trade partner is China, but as an organization, EU is quite ahead of everybody else. Although sanctions are affecting our trade turnover, we used to have more than 400,000 millions of dollars, but we cannot be indifferent what is going on in EU, and not only in relation to Brexit. There are a lot of processes which will affect the functioning of the European Union, and it's very important for us to understand how it will affect our trade and economic relations. But to choose the most interesting possibility for us, well, it's an approach which characterizes countries, or politicians rather, who would like to intervene and monitor the processes which are going on in other countries. We are not doing that. Well, like, for example, they influenced the processes of preparation of Brisbane Accords in Macedonia, and now in Germany. Now they try to use American ambassador in order to influence German policy in relation to their approach to gas pipeline. We are not doing this, although the mass media used to say that we are satisfied with this problems with Brexit. No, it's not the case. We are interested in having strong and consolidated European Union. We will see what will happen. We are ready to cooperate with Great Britain, with the EU, if Great Britain pulls out from EU. But what kind of ways and means we shall employ, we'll see. As to Serbia, you've mentioned it correctly. In Europe, they believe that Serbia, sooner or later, will have to choose between Russia and the EU. It's a mentality which is obsolete for many years already. It reflects obsolete colonial approaches. I mentioned several times this example when EU unilaterally demanded something. So the first war in Ukraine, 2003, Karel de Gucht became then the commissioner of EU. So at that time he demanded from Ukrainians to decide whether they are with Russia or with the EU. It's rather provocative approach which reflects the mood of great powers. It does not correspond to our decisions which we have adopted in OSCE or together with EU. In Serbia, they started negotiating different chapters of this agreement, and EU demands Serbia to recognize independence of Kosovo if Serbia wants to join EU, and to follow the policy of EU in relation to Russia, including sanctions. Well, it's not polite to follow such an approach. EU is proud of its unity, but this unity recently is based on positions of the minority. When such a rather aggressive minority demands from other EU member states to follow policy against Russia, which is a discriminatory one. That's why my advice was to get rid of such a logic, such an approach, such a mentality, either with Russia or European Union. Let's come back to the times when great European politicians like de Gaulle and other politicians talked about their vision or their idea of a common Europe, first from Atlantic Ocean to Urals and then to the Pacific Unions. Well, we are supporting indivisible security, but in practice we don't see this. We are supporting such an approach, such a philosophy of cooperation on the basis of the balance of interests and without imposing ideas which are developed by a narrow circle of countries.
Austrian television, Carola Schneider. There were times when there were active talks or negotiations on peacekeeping mission in Donbass. Now there is no more talk about this. Does it mean that such negotiations are not in place anymore, or behind the closed doors is anything ongoing? Because it's not clear so far. Well, same is happening in Syria. It's what I've mentioned in the beginning. It's about the international law and rules that are being invented and presented as absolute truth. Talking about international law, there are Minsk agreements approved by the UN Security Council. In accordance with this agreement, all issues should be addressed in a direct dialogue between Kyiv and Donetsk and Lugansk, with the mediatory role of the EU. In accordance with these agreements, an OSCE observation mission is in place in Donbass, in all places where the mission is to ensure monitoring of Ukraine's compliance with human rights obligations and other issues. When this OSCE special monitoring mission started having difficulties with security, when there were incidents where one member of this mission was killed because of a mine, the mission conducted an investigation, and when the investigation showed that the mine was not the one by the Donbass people, then this issue wasn't discussed any longer. On repeated occasions, we called upon our colleagues from the OSCE to be more transparent in their reports, because in most cases they write simply that a certain number of shellings took place on certain days and there have been a certain amount of victims, that it's not clear who shelled whom. Then finally, the mission made a report when it was demonstrated what victims and what targets the Donbass and the Ukrainian armed forces had. And it makes it quite clear that Ukrainian army shells villages, and the Donbass people simply respond. And statistics on the part of the Ukrainian army is higher, and same goes for the victims among civilian population. As you represent the media, I would like to say this. I have repeated on many occasions to my Western colleagues where they tried to persuade me that the blame for all incidents at the line, at the touching line, is to be put on the Donbass. I repeated then that on the western side, on the eastern side of this line, there are real-life broadcasts showing what is happening on that part. And I always recommended my Western partners who doubt these real facts to suggest Western journalists ensure same work on the side of the contact line controlled by the Ukrainian army. I can't remember of anyone working there, not just on a constant basis, but even from time to time. A BBC team showed up there once, and it prepared a quite objective, in my view, report, but since then no one has been there. If journalists are interested in presenting truth, be it BBC, Euronews or any other media, then if your government doesn't encourage you to work in one of the most problematic geopolitical regions in the world, then let me ask you to work at the western part, the west part of the contact line. At least you will learn much more than what we see from the reports that have been prepared from outside. As for the reports of the special humanitarian missions, in response to the concerns expressed by representatives of Germany and France, we suggested to arm the observers with small and light arms, and however the Western colleagues didn't agree with that, and they said they didn't have experience with such work, and then the President Putin proposed establishing a UN mission to ensure protection of the special humanitarian mission. The draft resolution was very simple. It based on a legal act and the mandate of the OSCE and the UN in support of the Minsk agreements. It implied that observers of the special humanitarian mission, wherever they are in Donbass, should be accompanied by blue helmets from the UN. It was a simple international legal approach. However, in response to it, our Western and US colleagues put forward their rules invented by a good worker. According to these rules, it was not about facilitating direct dialogue between Kiev and Donbass, as enshrined in the Minsk agreements, and ensuring the resolution of all issues under mediation of the OSCE. Instead, it was about a 30,000 military contingent of the UN with heavy weapons, including all possible armed forces, and take over under control the whole perimeter of Donbass territory that we are now talking about. Then dissolve police and local administrations in Donetsk and Lugansk, to send their UN police missions and the UN administration, which were to control and manage the situation. But under such rule that was proposed by the United States, no elections should be held. Instead of consensus, instead of compromise between Donbass and Kiev, a unilateral decision would be imposed. We explained that for such reasons we cannot get back from the decisions of the UN Security Council and why we cannot substitute international law with this rule invented by court worker. I thought everyone understands this, but they simply pretend to say that the only way to resolve the Ukrainian crisis was to follow the policy of Ukrainian authorities. It's unrealistic, however, and it's not realistic to hope for it. It would be much better if our German and French colleagues who signed in the Normandy format the complex of package of measures to support the Minsk agreements, and all members of the international community, including the US, facilitate direct dialogue, direct negotiations to implement the Minsk package of measures. Sputnik. Good afternoon. Sputnik International Information Agency. In the end of once again, Sputnik Information Agency, Mr. Lavrov, in the end of past week, media reported that US had an intention to strengthen its position in the Arctic, following the actions of the Russian Federation and China. In accordance, it was reported that they planned to send warships to the Arctic region, which would be the first US Navy mission to ensure freedom of navigation there. In May 2017, there was an event held in Alaska, and you said there that there is no potential for any conflict in the Arctic. In this regard, I would like to ask you, how do you evaluate the intentions of the US to increase their presence in the Arctic, and can it serve as another pretext for building up conflict potential between Russia and the US, and whether the Russian Federation is going to take any actions if the US sends its navy there? Well, the US is an Arctic power, and in accordance with international law, including the International Convention on the Law of the Sea of 1982, can, as all other Arctic states, use the sea routes in this region, and even non-Arctic states can use the sea routes in this region. The navy of all countries can use these routes following the specific rules. A French ship, for example, used the Northern Sea route, and together with our colleagues, we discussed all details of the situation, and there are no questions. So we believe that everyone should respect these rules. The Russian Federation bears responsibility for ensuring effective functioning and the safety and security in the Northern Sea route. As for the reasons why the US wants to increase its attention to this region, well, let me remind you that the US is an Arctic state, and if it complies with the international law, including the law of the Russian Federation and the use of the Northern Sea route, I see no problems. Whether they want to escalate the conflict potential, well, I wouldn't like to guess. But in all the regions, the US want to create such a conflict potential, including the South China Sea, where they try to get involved in territorial disputes between South Asian states. And I very much hope that their manner of creating situations, escalating the relationships between various regions of the world will not, some such things will not happen in the Arctic region, because it wouldn't contribute to our cooperation within the Arctic Council. Once again, let me remind you that the Russian Federation is responsible for ensuring the safety and security of the Northern Sea route. Colleagues, shall we sum up maybe the last two questions? Sinhua, please. Good afternoon, Mr. Lavrov. Xinhua Information Agency, China. I have the following question. This year, and most recently, the US is pursuing a trade war against China, and Russia also faces an increasingly difficult global situation. Experts believe that such situation only strengthens the solidarity between our countries. Let me ask you, do you agree with that opinion? And in your view, how will our relationship develop regarding the foreign policy cooperation? Thank you. There are many speculations as to how the relationship in the so-called triangle Russia, China and the US are developing. There are those willing to get back to the times when under Nixon administration the US decided to normalize relations with China to detain the Soviet Union. There are many of those wishing something else. For example, some time ago from Tokyo, from the leading party, ideas were voiced that a peace agreement between Russia and Japan needs to be signed, in particular to detain China. You know, when everything that's happening between our countries is considered through the angle of damaging these relations, it is only disappointing because it's reflecting either-or mentality, either with us or against us. So let's use someone against someone else. Neither Russia nor China make friends against someone else. We are friends because we are neighbors, because we have many shared interests, because we are strategic partners in international affairs, and because we have a similar vision on how we can make a world more democratic and more stable and prosperous. That's exactly the basis of our strategic partnership and our comprehensive cooperation. And we also have a common interest in not just preserving the global trade system, but also in making it more manageable and clear, so that it's less vulnerable to unilateral actions of some states. I think for years ahead we'll have a lot of things to do, but we are willing to achieve results. And the final question.
Anna Usanova, Moscow-Baku Agency. Sergey Viktorovich, 2018 marked the 10th anniversary of friendship and strategic partnership between Russia and Azerbaijan. There were tight contacts at the highest levels. What's your opinion of 2018 for the bilateral relations between our countries? Do you think this was a breakthrough year? And the second question, last year, Moscow was supposed to, right after Baku and Tehran, host the trilateral summit, Russia, Iran, Azerbaijan, but it didn't happen. So what are the prospects for this summit, and what are the prospects for the format Turkey, Russia, Azerbaijan? As for our relations with Azerbaijan, I wouldn't resort to terms such as breakthrough, because our relations are developing in a gradual manner. And last year we had meetings with between presidents that were substantial. I also met my counterpart in Baku and in Moscow, Mr. Mamedyarov. Our economic ministries also had a tight cooperation. We held Baku Humanitarian Forum under the patronage of Mr. Aliyev and our president, so there were many official and non-official events, including the festival of songs called Heat or Jara. That's very popular both in Russia and Azerbaijan. So the last year I would describe as a very positive year. We cooperated tightly within the Commonwealth of Independent States, the United Nations, the OSCE, the Council of Europe, where, by the way, which is biased against Azerbaijan and tries to discriminate the rights of Azerbaijani parliamentarians in the Council of Europe. The last year was the year when in Armenia there was a change of authorities, and as for our contribution into the co-presidency in the Karabakh settlement group, well, there were only some preliminary meetings, but in January we plan to have a meeting with the foreign ministers of Armenia and Azerbaijan, and the meeting with the foreign ministers of France and Russia to settle this long-standing conflict that can be solved with the goodwill of Baku and Yerevan and with the support of international community, including the co-presidents of the group. I think that the statements expressed by Baku that it is ready to have a settlement of the conflict gives us hope that even the Armenian friends would be reciprocal. Regarding the second question, was it about format Russia, Azerbaijan, Iran? There has been no agreement as to having this format annually. Well, last year we couldn't hold this meeting of three presidents. This is a wrong conception. Well, another summit of Russia, Iran and Azerbaijan would take place, I can assure you. As for other possible formats with the participation of Azerbaijan, we didn't take any practical steps on this avenue, but we have to look at whether these formats would have any value added, because perhaps it wouldn't serve interests of Russia, Azerbaijan and other possible participants, but if we would see that there's a value added to these formats of interaction, then we would take pleasure at perusing this opportunity. Colleagues, I have to ask you to understand I have to continue my professional obligations now. I hope that you would enjoy the reception that would take place at 5 p.m., where you can continue talking to the heads of our ministries.